If you've been struggling with Path of Exile 2 or just looking for the easiest way to level up quickly, kill bosses, farm tons of loot, or otherwise just turn the game onto easy mode, then I have got the build for you in this video. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HDM here. Possibly my favorite starting build right now for beginners, and that is the Sorceress class. This build has so many different ways to kill your enemies and combos. There's pretty much something here for everybody, whether you like ice magic, fire, or lightning. We're using it all here, and to really good effect to rip through packs of enemies to clear levels fast, or shred bosses easily to move through the main story campaign. So if you like the Sorceress style and you want the easiest possible build to get started with in Path of Exile 2, then this should really be a big help. So let's jump right in. Moving on to skill gems and support gems first. We're going to start with the very first skills that you get in Path of Exile 2 and then progress through to what you might end up with after like the first act or so. And if you'd like to see more details on this build, I'll also have all this info in the written guide. A link for that is going to be down below. But starting with our first spell called Firebolt, this is what you're typically going to start with on the Sorceress class, and it's pretty basic. It's slowly moving fireball, but it can do some small AoE damage as well, so it's not bad for a starting skill. And the key here is that it is free to cast. It uses no mana, so you essentially can cast this infinitely or switch to it when your mana runs low, when you've been using your other abilities and you need that to recharge. So this is a nice basic skill to have in your toolkit at first, but we're eventually going to move away from this and swap in other skills. So I wouldn't really worry about upgrading, spending support gems here either. But that leads us to the next skill that I recommend called Spark. This is going to be a lightning-based spell that's going to spread out into lots of tiny, well, sparks as the name implies. There are some cool synergies with Spark, which we'll see in a minute, which make it an ideal DPS skill to start with in POE2, but just at a base level, even without support gems, it's going to be your go-to main source of damage to begin with because it uses so many projectiles, and those little bits of damage do add up. The downside, of course, is that casting this does slow down your character movement, so positioning when using this skill is going to be important. You'll probably want to use it from the furthest distance possible to help you avoid taking damage while you cast it. And now in terms of starting support gems, it's pretty easy to amp this skill up if you focus on improving its speed, which is going to result in more projectiles faster. So to start with, you could use Acceleration, which is a dexterity gem. That provides 40% more projectile speed. And you could also throw on Arcane Tempo if you want to increase your cast speed by 25%. Both of those added together are going to equate to a lot more damage with this particular skill. So next you want to pick up the Flame Wall skill, which is a damage over time effect that also has a chance to ignite targets for even more fire damage. But the other really great thing about this skill that I like is it also increases the damage of our other projectiles. This happens when you lay down the wall in front of you and cast the projectiles through it. Now the added damage here is not much stat-wise, however when you stack this up with a skill that has lots of projectiles, like Spark for example, which we just talked about, well then all that extra damage is going to add up pretty quick. So the combination of Flame Wall and then casting sparks through it is by far the best way for the starting Sorceress build to deal with both basic enemy types and bosses as well. This combination just shreds both very quickly. And now there is some setup involved, obviously, which you'll have to get used to, and especially with bosses, you'll need to find times in their attack pattern where you can set up both skills. But that's why we also added some speed to the Spark skill to make that combo a little bit easier to execute. But this is a great way, like I said, to burn bosses on the Sorceress, and also an equally solid choice for ripping through packs of enemies for like the first 10 levels or so. However, past that, we're going to want to specialize into ice magic next, which is also incredibly powerful, but has the added benefit of crowd control, freezing enemies in place so that they can't damage you. So for that, we want to unlock Frostbolt as soon as possible. This skill is insane because it has so many perks and supports already built into the skill at base, even before you start adding support gems. So what this does is it's going to fire a slow projectile, which pierces through targets, meaning it's going to keep traveling, hit enemies even beyond that. It also applies Chilled Ground, which is a great effect that slows enemies down. And the cold damage that this skill does also applies the freeze effect, which is huge for this build. It basically, freezes enemies in place. Also, don't forget that you can still stack extra damage from the Flame Wall ability if you want. You can cast that first and then shoot the Frostbolt through it to get even more damage from the skill when facing tougher enemies. So Frostbolt as a base skill, like I said, it's really good, but once you apply the right support gems, then that really amps up the amount of targets you can hit and how quickly they can get frozen in place. So first, I recommend the Scatter Shot support gem here, as this is going to change the skill from just firing 1 projectile into firing 3. Yes, that's going to lower the cast speed a little bit, but the fact that this skill is already that piercing type, like I said, it's going to maintain itself through multiple targets. And you can get a really good layering effect of this as you follow around those orbs, letting them slowly freeze everything in front of you, and you just walk behind and keep your distance, basically. Now, speaking of freeze, the next support gem I highly recommend for Frostbolt, that's called Glaciation, which basically just causes more freeze to build up, 50% more. So typically within like 2 to 3 rounds of Frostbolt orbs, that's going to be enough to freeze most normal enemies. But you can see the power of just spamming this one ability once you have the right support gems in place. Everything gets frozen solid in front of you, and it's so easy to deal with enemies at this point. Now, one other piece that you're going to want to unlock with a level 5 skill gem is the skill called Cold Snap, which takes the ice damage on this build to a completely new level. With this skill, you can quickly down most elites by freezing them with Frostbolt and then snapping them with this skill once they are frozen for a huge damage combo. This damage also spreads to nearby frozen enemies, so the AoE potential here is really high as well. And of course, this skill is going to one-shot most normal enemies, spreading that damage, blowing up packs of enemies like we talked about, though it actually does pretty well against bosses, but we do have another ability for that too. Now, for support gems on Cold Snap, anything here that sort of expands the AoE or the range of that is going to be good. Magnified Effect, for example, creates 40% more area of effect, so you can play around with something like that. Now, a few more skills here that I recommend for the Sorceress, just to round out the build. As I said, the ice stuff is really insane for blowing up crowds of enemies, but it won't always work on bosses, which is where I recommend picking up the level 4 skill. This is called Ember Fussilade, and it's kind of similar to Spark in that it creates multiple projectiles, up to 6, I think. But the difference here is that you can hold on to the skill to collect all those projectiles and then release it to fire them all at once. So basically, this is going to be great for bursting down boss health bars because you can cast this in between mechanics. You can hold on to the charges while dodge rolling and so on. So it's actually a really good skill for boss fights. Now, some support gems I found early which do improve the damage of the skill a lot include Controlled Destruction, just for more base damage at the cost of the critical chance, and then Concentrated Effect, which does actually work here because the fireballs from this skill are considered AoE damage. Then a couple more skills would be Ice Nova. This can knock back enemies if you happen to be getting swarmed, so it is nice for controlling groups and getting out of trouble. And then if you happen to pick up a Spirit Gem, then Arctic Armor also contributes a lot to this build, as it can quickly help to build up that freeze effect, especially on bosses and elites, and it can do a lot of damage when enemies hit you with a melee attack. Okay, let's check out the passive skill tree next for the Sorceress, and there's a couple ways that I recommend you do this just at the very start of the game. For one thing, Sorceress is a very weak class in terms of survivability, so you are going to get beat up quite a bit, but it is nice that you have sort of a defensive side that you can put points in first if you're having trouble surviving. So if that's the case, and if you're a beginner to this game, that is certainly going to be the case. I recommend, maybe your first 3 to 4 points put on the defensive side. So you're going to get bonuses to maximum energy shield, more energy shield, a percent increase to energy shield, and you can even go all the way up to the main node for 30% increased shield and 10 to intelligence. Now, if you're more experienced, you're probably not going to do that. You're going to go all offense, but as a beginner, hey, a little bit of extra survivability, especially against those first few early bosses, is actually going to make a huge difference. And you can always respec these points and put them back into offensive passives once you don't need them anymore. But speaking of which, obviously you'll be focused more on the offensive side of things, going down the spell damage route. So we have increased spell damage here, 2 nodes, 3, 4, and then all the way up to this 5th node. Raw power gives you 20% increased spell damage and 10 to intelligence. That's really good. Moving up to elemental damage, we then have the ability to specialize in the 3 different elemental types. So you can get bonus fire damage, bonus ice damage, bonus lightning damage. Now, early on, to be honest, you're using all 3 types of damage pretty consistently, as you saw in the skills section. I'm using all of these, so I do get a bonus to using these. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit in the equipment section, but yes, with Path of Exile 2, you actually have the ability to specialize a certain amount of skill points into specific weapon sets or weapon pathways. So let's say that you had a flame staff that was really good that you wanted to use for all your flame abilities. It gives you bonus flame damage. You could specialize points here. And then let's say you also had a great ice staff. You could specialize the same points here. And so you could get the same bonuses with half the points. Now for me, as you'll see in a minute, I didn't have good staff options right away. My best staff that I found just has a bonus to spell damage. So I pretty much wanted to get these either way. But in the future, like I said, if I do get a really good, flame staff or ice staff, if I get both, I can specialize here using weapon set points, and I could essentially save, 2 points doing that. But moving on, obviously early game still, you're going to take elemental damage. I do have some notes here in strength. The reason why strength is helpful is it does convert to maximum health. So if you're lacking, life on your gear, you can get some extra life points through specializing in strength. Getting a little bit more strength in your attributes is fine. And then where we'll eventually end up going here, right about level 20, is you can come down here and start increasing your spell damage. So this is going to be huge in terms of boosting that raw damage for the build. You can see 10% increased spell damage here, another 10%, another 10%, and then a huge 30% spell damage increase with 5% reduced cast speed. So that is definitely where you want to head next at the start of the game. And like I said, at this point, I probably have enough survivability. I could go back, respec these defensive and energy shield points, and just go right for the spell damage. That's what I'm going to end up doing next anyways. Okay, so we can talk briefly about the gear setup here, especially stats that you want to look out for. Again, just the starting build here. I have mostly epic quality items I was able to pick up in Act 1. Now, I mentioned this on my other build video for the Mercenary. You always want to look out for movement speed on your boots. That should be the first item that you're looking for. You can get this. You can get this from the vendors in town. I was able to find a unique version, which is also giving me intelligence and some good bonuses for energy shield. So this is actually really good for the Sorceress. But yeah, the main thing here is the movement speed. Now, in terms of staff, you will see a lot of different options, and you'll get these as you're playing. What's best? Well, it kind of depends on what the bonuses are. You can get bonused to fire damage. You can get bonus to cold damage, to shock. So you kind of need to structure your build based on which of those staff types and bonuses that you get. But something that's really easy, especially for Act 1, is looking for increased spell damage. Like we talked about in the passives, increased spell damage is going to buff all of your skills, whether it's fire, ice, or shock. And so this is what I ended up making my main staff on the build, because I did have that increased spell damage stat line. It worked out really well for all those abilities. Now, I did roll an extra stat line, and I happened to get increased cold damage, which is totally fine because I am spamming that Frostbolt skill a lot on this build, so this works out really well. Now, initially, I did have this staff, which was giving me that increased fire damage, but that's really where I'm at right now. I think the spell damage is just making it really easy, and then obviously later I'll probably specialize with different elemental staff types as soon as I get some really good versions of that. What other stats should you look for? Obviously, your main resource, intelligence. As many points of intelligence as you can get is going to be really helpful. And then maximum mana, maximum life. That would be the next thing I would look out for. You want to stack those as high as possible. Life regeneration, honestly, a pretty good stat if you can stack up a couple of these on the build somehow. But then otherwise, stuff like gain life per enemy hit or gain life per enemy killed. You could get the same thing for mana. Those are really good stats to look out for as well. So yeah, still some magic pieces that I'll be working on upgrading next, but that's pretty much where the build is at right now. So in terms of how the build plays overall, as I said in the intro, I'm really impressed with the Sorceress class as kind of a starter build or for a leveling build. It is really powerful, both against normal enemies and bosses. What's nice is, as you saw, your gear doesn't make a huge difference. It really just comes down to the spells that you use, how you use those, and combine them together, which I gave you some really good combos to work with on this build. And then obviously your support gem upgrades to make those skills even stronger. But yeah, if you're looking for something to quickly get you through the start of the campaign, I highly recommend you give this build a try. And if you need any more help with the build, there'll be a link coming for the written guide. So be sure to check that out down in the description and the pinned comment. And as always, thanks for watching. I hope you're doing well, and I will see you around in the next video.